can't prove evolution. As opposed to proving the young Earth theory from primitive anonymous documents? Well, actually, man has unlocked the world of genetics to reveal that all living things have and do evolve.
To claim that genetics proves evolution is pure nonsense. Similarities in the DNA of chimps and humans proves nothing. The alleged 98% similarity has recently been questioned in the proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences. Roy Britton, author of the study, puts the figure at about 95% when insertions and deletions are included. But nevertheless, even at the 98% figure, it is notable that the Darwinists always use percentages to hide the fact that the 2% represents over 200 million base pairs that are different between them.
To quote the famous evolutionary biologist Stephen Jay Gould, creationist critics often charge that evolution cannot be tested and therefore cannot be viewed as a properly scientific subject at all. This claim is rhetorical nonsense.
This is rather humorous. Here he quotes the late Stephen Jay Gould, who merely makes an assertion without providing any support for the claim. And what's really funny is that the thinking atheist would even quote Gould at all. Gould has been a thorn in the side of Darwinists for a couple of decades now. Because of his frankness, he has embarrassed the Darwinian community to such a point that most of them have avoided him or chosen to attack him. Richard Dawkins is a gradualist, and he said this about Stephen Jay Gould, and I quote, "I think the tendency of American intellectuals to learn their evolution from him is unfortunate, and that's putting it mildly," unquote. Well, maybe that's because Gould said the following, and I quote, "Richard Dawkins would narrow the focus of explanation even one step further, to genes, struggling for reproductive success within passive bodies. Under the control of genes, a hyper-Darwinian idea that I regard as logically flawed and basically foolish character of Darwin's genuinely radical intent," unquote. Gould went on to say the following, and I quote, "I find a fatal flaw in Dawkins' attack from below. No matter how much power Dawkins wishes to assign to genes, there is one thing he cannot give them: discrete visibility to natural selection. Selection simply cannot see genes and pick among them directly," unquote. Steven Pinker, in defense of evolutionary psychology, had this to say about Stephen Jay Gould's resistance to it, and I quote, "Gould is uninformed when he repeats the cliche that evolutionary reasoning is just cocktail party speculation. Gould's hostility to this exciting field is a missed opportunity," unquote. Well, Gould had a response, and he said the following: "Evolutionary psychology could, in my view, become a fruitful science by replacing its current penchant for narrow and often barren speculation," unquote. Atheist Daniel Dennett published a book called Darwin's Dangerous Idea. And in that book, Dennett spent an entire chapter contradicting, discrediting, and ridiculing Gould's ideas. And Gould wasn't pleased about that, and this is what Gould said about Dennett's book. And I quote, "Dennett's singularly contentless commentary reminded me of this motto and its corollary. When you have nothing to say it louder," unquote. John Maynard Smith, who is from the Dawkins camp, he had this to say about Gould, and I quote, "Because of the excellence of his essays, Gould has come to be seen by non-biologists as the preeminent evolutionary theorist. In contrast, the evolutionary biologists with whom I have discussed his work tend to see him as a man whose ideas are so confused as to be hardly worth bothering with, but as one who should not be publicly criticized because he at least is on our side against the creationists," unquote. Well, Stephen Gould didn't care for that, so he fired back with the following, and I quote, I am amused by an irony that has recently ensnared evolutionary theory. A movement of strict constructionism, a self-styled form of Darwinian fundamentalism, has risen to some prominence in a variety of fields. From the English biological heartland of John Maynard Smith to the uncompromising ideology of his compatriot Richard Dawkins, to the equally narrow and more ponderous writing of the American philosopher Daniel Dennett. Unquote. Kevin Padian was an expert witness for evolution in the Kitzmiller trial. And he was presented with a quote from Stephen Jay Gould. And this is what Gould had written, and I quote, "The evolutionary trees that adorn our textbooks have data only at the tips and nodes of their branches. The rest is inference, however reasonable, not the evidence of fossils," unquote. So what did Kevin Padian think of that quote? Well, he said Stephen Jay Gould didn't know what he was talking about. Yep, Gould had said a lot of things that upset gradualists. Here's another quote from Gould that upset some Darwinists. It goes like this, and I quote, "One has to accept the idea with a dose of faith." This is talking about evolution. "Because the process occurs far too slowly to yield any observable result in a human lifetime. Thus, we can document evolution from the fossil record and infer the process from taxonomic relationships of living species, but we cannot see evolution on human timescales in the wild," unquote. Gould said some other things. One time he said, and I quote, "Paleontologists and evolutionary biologists in general are famous for their facility in devising plausible stories, but they often forget that plausible stories need not be true," unquote. Also, Gould said the following, "The fossil record had caused Darwin more grief than joy. Nothing distressed him more than the Cambrian explosion, the coincident appearance of almost all complex organic designs." Gould went on to say, "Contrary to Darwin's expectation that new data would reveal gradualistic continuity with slow and steady expansion, all major discoveries of the past century have only heightened the massiveness and geological abruptness of this formative event," unquote. And the last quote from Gould goes like this, and I quote, "My own field of paleontology has strongly challenged the Darwinian premise that life's major transformations can be explained by adding up through the immensity of geological time the successive tiny changes produced generation after generation by natural selection," unquote. So if the thinking atheist wants to use Stephen Jay Gould as an authority figure, he has to deal with this stuff.
Number 3. If man evolved from monkeys, why do we still have monkeys? This is like asking, if America was colonized by the English, why do we still have England?
This analogy is sophomoric. The debate over chimps becoming humans has to do with the changes in species between chimps and humans and everything that came in between. The people who colonized America are no more different than the people in England today. So this analogy of his is just plain inane. Secondly, anthropologists are all over the board as to what man evolved from. Some say chimps, some say orangutans, some say a common ancestor, which they haven't a clue what that is, and some even suggest that gorillas evolved from man. But the problem is they have no evidence. Anthropologist Mary Leakey, just before she died, she said the following, and I quote, "All these trees of life with their branches of our ancestors, that's a lot of nonsense," unquote. Harvard's Richard Lewontin pretty much concurred with this view. He said the following, and I quote, Look, I'm a person who says in this book that we don't know anything about the ancestors of the human species. All the fossils which we have dug up and are claimed to be ancestors, we haven't the faintest idea whether they are ancestors. All you got is Homo sapiens there, you've got the fossils there, you've got another fossil there, and it's up to you to draw the lines, because there are no lines. Unquote.
Next question, please. Number 4. The human eye is too complex to have evolved. This argument is also known as irreducible complexity. This gross oversimplification ignores creatures like the single-celled euglena, which have evolved antennae for light.
Wrong again. The antenna that the euglena has nothing to do with vision, but has to do with photosynthesis, which the euglena needs to create starches, just like a plant does. Plants do not see.
Plus, consider this. The human eye is more poorly constructed and much less acute than the eye of the octopus or the great horned owl. Did God care more about the design of the horned owl than his own children?
To say that the human eye is poorly constructed is a prime example of ignorance of how and why the human eye is constructed the way that it is. The thinking atheist is doing nothing more than regurgitating the ignorance of people like Kenneth Miller and Michael Shermer concerning this claim. I would suggest you read a work entitled Eye Development, a view from the retina pigmented epithelium by Martinez and Morales, 2004. Then you'll learn what rubbish this claim of the thinking atheist is. And this question, did God care more about the horned owl than his children, is a prime example of why I said thinking atheist is an oxymoron. The octopus lives in the water, man does not. The owl is nocturnal and needs to see when it's flying around the woods at night looking for rodents. Crashing into trees at 40 miles an hour isn't exactly something it would relish. Man is not nocturnal and was given a brain to construct torches and flashlights should he need to venture out at night. God gave each what they needed for their environment.
Number 5. Atheism is actually a religion.
Of course, atheism is a religion. All religions are belief systems. So is atheism. It is the belief that all there is came about through strictly materialistic means without the aid of anything supernatural. And since that cannot be proven scientifically, it is taken on by faith by the atheist.
Number 6. Oh yeah? Well, scientist X believes in God. Well, that's nice. So did icons like Copernicus, Kepler, Galileo, who also lived during the time of dirt floors, bleeding sick people to cure them of illness, and burning witches at the stake. Sir Isaac Newton was a believer and theologian. He was also an alchemist. Did Newton's groundbreaking research on gravity and the laws of motion also prove his belief that metals had magical powers and could be combined to make gold? Cherry pick all you want. The fact is, 93% of the members of the National Academy of Sciences reject the concept of God. That's not just a majority, it's an overwhelming majority.
You know the old saying, liars figure and figures lie? I'm not aware of any study that claims that 93% of the National Academy of Sciences rejects the concept of God. I am aware of a study that was done by Larson and Whittam in 1998, who sent a questionnaire to 517 members of the National Academy of Sciences from the biological and the physical sciences, and including mathematicians, physicists, and astronomers. The return rate was slightly over 50%. That means that 49% of them didn't respond at all. So that leaves you with, what? A little over 250 people that they talked to? Of the ones that did respond, it was only 72% that didn't believe in God. And I find it interesting that there are over 2,100 members in the Academy, and they only sent out 517 questionnaires. And they only got responses from a little over 250 people. Sounds like a real scientific poll to me, right? And you talk about cherry picking. Secondly, since when do majorities determine what is true or not? There was a time when the majority of the world believed that the world was flat. The writers of the Bible in that time said that it was round, and they were in the minority. Hans Alvin won a Nobel Prize in physics because his ideas often conflicted with the generally accepted or standard theories. Alvin always had trouble with the peer review system, especially as practiced by Anglo-American astrophysical journals. He said the following, I quote, "I have no trouble publishing in Soviet astrophysical journals, but my work is unacceptable to the American astrophysical journals," unquote. As for Sir Isaac Newton in alchemy, he at least had the excuse of living in the 1600s when the scientific method was not as developed as it is today. But almost 400 years later, Darwinist Henry Fairfield Osborn, who was the director of the American Museum of Natural History, declared that he found a fossil molar tooth belonging to the Pliocene period in western Nebraska near Snake Brook. This tooth allegedly bore common characteristics of both man and ape. As extensive scientific debate began surrounding this fossil, which came to be called Nebraska Man, in which some interpreted this tooth as belonging to Pithecanthropus erectus, while others claimed it was closer to human beings. Nebraska Man was also immediately given a scientific name, Hesperopithecus harlequinii. Well, as it turned out, the tooth belonged to an extinct form of pig. Picture that, will you? An entire imaginary man was constructed from the tooth of a pig. And that was in the 20th century. The fraudulent embryo drawings of Ernest Haeckel appeared in biology textbooks for decades. What excuse did the Darwinists who put them in there have? Isn't it funny that Stephen Jay Gould even commented on it? And here's what Gould said, and I quote, "We should not be surprised that Haeckel's drawings entered 19th century textbooks, but we do, I think, have the right to be both astonished and ashamed by the century of mindless recycling that has led to the persistence of these drawings in a large number, if not a majority, of modern textbooks," unquote. And then in 1999, a time when science had the most advanced forensic techniques available to them, the National Geographic Society put on display in its museum in Washington, D.C., a fossil fraud, which they called Archaeoraptor, which goes to show what lengths the Darwinist community will go to calm the public. They know the public is gullible enough to accept anything that they put out there on display. So what excuse did the National Geographic Society have? Is anybody ignorant enough to say they didn't have the resources to expose the fraud? So this idea about putting down people who lived in houses with dirt floors is rather funny when we see the nonsense put on display by the Darwinists on their nice shiny marble floors.